In my last episode, 2 weeks ago, I took a deep dive into the significance of Yeshua's last meal, which is also known in Hebrew, of course, as a Seudat Siyum, meaning a meal of completion, because he had completed his mission here on earth. During the meal, Yeshua took a piece of matzah and a cup of wine, and offering them to each of his talmidim, he introduced the new covenant. He also used those two elements, symbols of his body and blood, which were offered as the eternal sacrifice later that same day. It was Wednesday, the 14th of Aviv, in the year 30 CE. So after having sung the Hallel Psalms, Yeshua and his talmidim departed from the upper room, crossed the Kidron Valley, and headed to the place where they had often sat together after his teachings at the temple court. The place, of course, was an olive grove high on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, which is known to most of us as Gethsemane. Having read portions of the four Gospels, we now want to take another deep dive into what actually occurred during those hours between his arrest and finally being put to death on the stake. And then next week we'll look at the latter part of that, from his resurrection through to his ascension to sit at the right hand of his Father. But because there are so many aspects that could be considered, it's necessary to spread it over 2 episodes. Now, while I would like to take a look at every event, I'll just focus on the main topics so that to some extent they have been glossed over in the past, because the majority of teachers and scholars in the Christian world have wanted to consider the events not against the Hebraic background or against the Aviv calendar, but rather a more European perspective. I will take up the narrative when they arrive at their usual place of meeting, where Yeshua said to his talmidim, "Sit here for a while I pray." Then Yeshua went with the 3 emissaries who were closest to him and went a short distance. Leaving even them, he went on a little further to pray to his Father. He did this 3 times, and then he returned to Kepha, Yaakov, and Yochanan, who had all fallen asleep. But as he prayed, Yeshua faced the reality of his pending death. As a human, he begged his Father, "Spare me from this trauma that lay ahead." But he also recognized that he alone had the ability to reverse the curse of death he, as Yahweh God, had placed upon all humanity. Through his anguish, he would have doubtless reflected on how, as Yahweh God, he had placed upon Adam the command not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But through the disobedience of Adam, all the descendants have been placed under a curse of death. Therefore, that same curse could only be reversed by the death of the Son of Man, whom we also know, of course, as the second Adam. Only through his own sacrificial death and subsequent resurrection could Yeshua pave the way for all mankind to be freed from that curse. Just as he had restored Elazar, that is Lazarus, to earthly life, so also the rest of all mankind will be given an opportunity to be raised to an earthly life in the Olam Haba, that's the age to come, and subsequently will receive life eternal if they acknowledge the kingship of Yeshua. Yeshua fulfilled the words of Shaul in 1 Corinthians 15:45, where he said, the Tanakh says, Adam was the first man, and he became a living human being. The last Adam has become a life-giving spirit. So returning from his prayer, he awoke the 3 sleeping emissaries. The time has come for the Son of Man to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Let's return to the others, because here comes my betrayer. While he was still speaking, Yehuda from Kiryat arrived, a large crowd wielding swords and clubs. Yehuda had previously agreed to give them a sign and went straight up to Yeshua and said, "Shalom, Rabbi." and kissed him. Yeshua responded, "Friend, do what you have to do." Then they moved forward and laid hold of Yeshua and arrested him. At that stage, Kepha, who had a sword hidden under his cloak, struck out at the servant of the Kohen HaGadol, or high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Yeshua responded by saying, "Put your sword back in its scabbard. This cup the Father has given me, I must drink it." With the captain of the guard, they arrested Yeshua and tied him up. Such was the outcome that suggests that they were all expecting Yeshua would actually start a rebellion at that very moment. They could not comprehend how he could so passively allow himself to be arrested. The whole plan of rebellion collapsed before their eyes. So Yeshua was led off to Caiaphas, the Kohen HaGadol, to conduct a mock trial. Kepha alone, with the second Talmud, followed at a distance as far as the gate of the Kohen HaGadol's residence, where Kepha sat down among the guards to warm himself by a fire outside the gate. It was against that background that Yochanan's Gospel in chapter 18 describes some of the details of that second Talmud, the one who had remained with Kepha. He was the one who was known personally to Caiaphas. He had been allowed to enter into the court, while Kepha, as a Galilean, was forced to remain outside the gate. However, the second Talmud went back out looking for Kepha and invited him into the courtyard. In Yochanan 18:25 and 26, he says, "While Shimon Kepha was standing and warming himself, the guards said to him, 'Are you also one of his Talmudim?' He denied it, saying, 'No, I'm not.' Then a relative of the man whose ear Kepha had cut off said, 'Didn't I see you with him in the grove of trees?' Twice Kepha had denied Yeshua. Then, as they were entering the courtyard, the woman at the gate said to Kepha, 'Aren't you one of the man's Talmudim?' He said, 'No, I'm not.' Again, Kepha had denied it. That instant, cock crowed. Kepha had denied Yeshua 3 times, just as it had been said earlier. So who was that second Talmud? The one known to Caiaphas, the one who was also able to speak to the woman guarding the gate and gain approval from her for Kepha to enter the courtyard. The answer lies back in Yeshua's last Seder, where the narrative suggests that there were 14 men present in the upper room at the beginning of the meal. And that was Yeshua, 12 emissaries, and 1 other. Yehuda of Kariat left the room early, leaving behind the 11 emissaries and 1 whom the narrative calls the one Yeshua particularly loved. He was said to recline next to Yeshua at the table. As I previously suggested, it appears that had been Elazar, or Lazarus, whom Yeshua had raised from the death just about a month earlier. That same Elazar appears also to be of the one who actually wrote the 4th Gospel under the pseudonym of Yochanan. He was the only Talmud who remained with Kepha after Yeshua had been arrested. As the Gospel says, he was known to the Kohen HaGadol, meaning that he was part of the elite establishment in Jerusalem. Hence, the interrogation of Yeshua began. Just before dawn, on the 14th of Aviv, Yeshua was challenged first by Anon, then Caiaphas, who was not only the Kohen HaGadol, but also the Nasi, or president of the Sanhedrin, and as such was responsible for deciding the fate of Yeshua as it related to the commands of Torah. But because Caiaphas could find no charge to lay against Yeshua, he had great difficulty in convincing the common people that Yeshua should die. He needed to find someone who would be prepared to give false testimony of sufficient strength to render Yeshua guilty of a charge worthy of death. In the midst of that interrogation, according to Matthew 26, 60 to 68, two witnesses stepped forward with a testimony and gave Caiaphas the grounds that he needed to convict Yeshua. They said, "This man, Yeshua, said, 'I will tear down God's temple and build it again in 3 days.'" The witnesses reiterated the words Yeshua had uttered 12 months earlier at the time of Pesach in the year 29 CE. On that occasion, when he entered the temple courts, he overturned the tables of the merchants and the money changers. And then it said in Yochanan chapter 2 verse 19, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." The short-term fulfillment of those words refers to his own death and resurrection. But we also now know that there is a long-term fulfillment that is yet to occur. While he did actually rise from death after 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb, the greater fulfillment of his words has largely been overlooked. But as we now know, the words of Peter, 2 Kepha, chapter 3, verse 8, it says, "Moreover, dear friends, I do not want you ignorant of this. With the Master, 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. Therefore, based on Kepha's words, Yeshua will restore the temple in the 3rd day. The significance of that is that it will be built sometime during his 1,000-year reign of restoration. So we must take cognizance of the reality that we are now just 5 years away from the dawn of that 3rd millennium since Yeshua died. We apply his words to the long-term fulfillment. We are only 5 years away from the beginning of that 3rd day which he spoke about. So returning to Yeshua's trial, in response to the statement about the temple, Caiaphas put Yeshua under an oath and asked him, "By the living God, tell us, are you the Mashiach, the Son of God?" But Yeshua remained silent. Finally, Yeshua did respond with the very words that Caiaphas wanted to hear. "I tell you that one day you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." At this, the Kohen Gadol tore his robes and shouted, "Blasphemy!" The die was cast. In accordance with Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 24 verse 16, "Whoever blasphemes the name of Yahweh must be put to death, and the entire community must stone him." So in accordance with Torah, Yeshua should have been taken out and stoned to death by the authority of the Sanhedrin. But approximately 1 month earlier, when Yeshua had raised Elazar from death, Caiaphas convened yet another meeting of the Sanhedrin to determine what should be done with both Yeshua and Elazar. Many of the common people, having witnessed the miracle of the raising of Elazar, became rebellious towards the Judean authorities, so that the Sanhedrin became fearful that if they did not remove both Yeshua and Elazar from the scene, the Romans would come and destroy both the temple and the nation. It was at this time that Caiaphas said in Yochanan 11, "Don't you see that it is better if one man dies on behalf of the people, so that the whole nation won't be destroyed?" Now, he didn't speak this way on his own initiative. Rather, since he was the Kohen Gadol that year, he was prophesying that Yeshua was about to die on behalf of the nation. But Caiaphas knew that his own words were prophetic, and he would cause a riot if he had Yeshua stoned to death. Faced with that reality, he was left with only one option. He had to pass Yeshua over to Pilate as the governor of Rome. That way, the responsibility for Yeshua's death would pass from the shoulders of Caiaphas to that of the Romans. But little did Caiaphas know that Yeshua himself had already determined how he was going to die. By saying to Nicodemus in Yochanan chapter 3 verse 14, just as Moshe lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, those words of Yeshua are profoundly important, because when Israel was forced to travel round the outer edges of the land of Edom on their sojourn towards Israel, they again held Yahweh in contempt and grumbled that they would have been better to have been left to remain in Egypt. So in response, Yahweh sent poisonous snakes among the people, and those who were bitten died. Hence, we are told in Bamidbar, or Numbers 21 verses 7 to 9, the people came to Moshe and said, we've sinned by speaking against Yahweh and against you. Pray to Yahweh that he will rid us of these snakes. Moshe prayed for the people, and Yahweh answered Moshe, make a poisonous snake and put it on a pole. When anyone has been bitten and sees it, he will live. Moshe made a bronze snake and put it on the pole. If a snake had bitten someone, then they looked towards the bronze snake, they stayed alive. The significance of those words are that Yeshua was saying that he would be raised on a pole as a means by which he would die on behalf of all mankind who had been bitten by the words of the original serpent back in Gan Eden. That is why, through his own sacrificial death, he will raise all mankind from death so that they will look upon him for support and forgiveness, and thus they will be able to stay alive eternally. So just as the snake on the pole served to spare the people of Israel who were repentant for their contemptuous rejection of Yahweh, so also Yeshua during the Olam Haba will spare the people from second death, provided they accept him as their Redeemer and their King. But that could only occur because he was to be raised on a pole as a means of his execution. If he had died by the stoning at the hands of the Sanhedrin, redemption of mankind would never have occurred. So all humans would have remained eternally dead. Now moving on to Yochanan, chapter 18, verses 28, Yahweh says, they led Yeshua from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. But even Pilate could find no civil charge to bring against Yeshua. As he said in verses 29 to 33, Pilate went outside and said to them, what charge are you bringing against this man? Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him in accordance with your own law. Because Pilate refused to charge Yeshua, the Judeans responded by saying, we don't have the legal power to put anyone to death. That was a barefaced lie, because sometime after the death of Yeshua, we have the example of the death of Stephen, which is recorded in Acts chapter 6, verses 8 through 14, where we're told about the false trial by the Sanhedrin and the stoning on a charge of blasphemy, the same charge that was being levelled against Yeshua himself. So the Judeans, through the Sanhedrin, knew that they did have full authority to carry out the death sentence on someone who was accused of blasphemy. So their reason for passing Yeshua over to Pilate was based on a lie. Yet, that same lie enabled Yeshua to be killed in the manner that he had already foretold. That is, being hung on a pole, in contrast with the Jewish punishment for blasphemy, which would have been stoning. These are just some of the features surrounding the death of Yeshua that have largely been glossed over by the world clamouring to place a blame for the death of Yeshua squarely on the shoulders of the Jewish people. But even Pilate bought into the Judean intrigue by finally asking a straightforward question. Are you the King of the Jews? Yeshua, in response, gave an explanation about his reality, the reality of his kingship, which gave Pilate the excuse he needed to place his own charge. Pilate knew if he handed Yeshua back to the Judean authorities, there would be a riot for sure. Hence, we see that all who were involved had their own agendas, but were in conflict with each other. Yet the interplay between the Judeans and Pilate enabled Yeshua to be executed in the manner that he had previously prophesied. In Yochanan 18:33-37, the dialogue between Yeshua and Pilate draws to a close with Pilate asking, Are you the king? Are you a king after all? Yeshua answered, You say I am a king. The reason I have been born, the reason I have come into this world, is to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to me. Pilate asked him, What is the truth? The question remained unanswered. At that stage, Yeshua's mission to be executed at the hands of the Goyim was now complete. Even though the Judean authorities had tried to avoid the civil disturbance during the week of Pesach and Matzah, they had achieved their goal, albeit sooner than they had planned. But as the death of the alleged troublemaker was now going to occur under the authority of Pilate, it meant the authorities avoided causing a civil uprising. Ultimately, Yeshua himself had won the day by bringing about his own death in the way that was going to fulfill the prophecies and his own words that had been spoken about how his death would be fulfilled. Considering all that had transpired between midnight and his execution, it is highly unlikely that Yeshua was actually impaled at 9 o'clock in the morning, as claimed by Mark chapter 15. By contrast, Yochanan chapter 18 says it was about noon on the preparation day of Pesach. Noon appears to be a much more realistic time, particularly when we consider Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 through 31, where it says that Pilate had made his decision, and then after that the soldiers took him into the headquarters building, where they tortured and humiliated him in a totally degrading manner, just as Isaiah had foretold. But he was finally led out and impaled on the stake. But where was Yeshua impaled? The actual location of his execution is not stated in any of the Gospels. However, assuming Yeshua was flogged and tortured in the fortress of Antonia, he was most likely led out over the ramp from the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives, which is mentioned in the Mishnah, Para 3.6. That was the same ramp that Yeshua had used when he rode into Jerusalem just 4 days earlier on Shabbat HaGadol. Today, that ramp no longer exists, but on the road leading up the western slopes of the Mount of Olives alongside the Hebrew cemetery, there is a sign on the boundary wall which reads, "The Path of the Cohen." Then further up on the same slope there is an olive grove between the low stone wall that is situated among the houses and apartments in the area, high on the western slopes of the Mount of Olives. That grove of olives lies due east from the dome of the tablets, or spirits, which is again situated northwest of the Dome of the Rock, towards the location of the fortress of Antonia, where that once stood. The location of the olive grove matches the position where the red heifers were actually taken, in accordance with Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 19, verse 4. It would face directly towards the first and the second temples. These reference points help us to locate the place where Yeshua was most likely impaled, and we can see the location matches the Torah, because the sight from high on the side of the Mount of Olives, where the red heifer was sacrificed, there was a direct line of sight all the way back to where the temple stood. Each time the red heifer preparation took place, the officiating priest sprinkled the blood of the heifer towards the entrance to the sanctuary, as the Talmud itself says in Voma 16a. All the walls surrounding the Temple Mount were high except for the east wall, as the priest who burned the red heifer stands on the Mount of Olives, where the red heifer was slaughtered and burned, and looked towards the sanctuary. There we have a direct connection between the killing and the burning of the red heifer and the execution of Yeshua. That was the only location that would have a direct line of sight all the way back to the entrance to the temple. Therefore, if Yeshua was actually executed in that location, it ensured that the requirements of Torah would be fulfilled, and Yeshua was executed facing the temple. It is agreed that by most scholars and theologians, whether Jewish or Christian, that the time stated in the four Gospels for Yeshua's death is 3 p.m. His death occurred at the same time as the Paschal Lamb was being slaughtered. Therefore, at the moment of his death, Yeshua ratified the new covenant by the shedding of his own blood. So during the hours between noon and 3, an unexplained period of darkness descended over Jerusalem and ended when Yeshua offered up his spirit. There have been many attempts to define the cause of that prolonged darkness, with many scholars and scriptural commentators looking for an eclipse that matches with the timing of Yeshua's death. But scientific logic shows that it was physically impossible for a solar eclipse to occur at the time of Pesach, because Pesach always falls on the day of the full moon. When the moon is full, it is always on the side of the earth away from the sun. It is impossible for the moon to block the face of the sun. Furthermore, no natural eclipse lasts more than 7 to 12 minutes, never 3 hours. So it was an astronomical impossibility for the darkness to occur between noon and 3 on the 14th of Aviv 30 CE to have been a natural occurring eclipse. The three synoptic gospels all speak of the 3-hour-long event in Matthew chapter 27, Mark chapter 15, and Luke chapter 23. So quoting from Luke in verses 44 to 45, it says, "It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun did not shine." That was recorded by Africanus in his History of the World, written around 221 CE. He also questioned the link between an eclipse and the earthquake. Both miraculous events were well documented, with many scholars having asked the question, was the darkness metaphorical or was it real? Surely there must have been an answer from the words of Scripture. An event that changed the course of human history could not be glossed over without an explanation. Darkness occurred also at the time of creation, when the narrative began. There are many examples of how God has and will impose darkness upon the face of the earth. Whether it is local or global, the situation is always the same. Prolonged periods of darkness are referred to in Exodus, Ezekiel, Joel twice over, Amos, Zephaniah, and Zechariah, along with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Only 2 of those 10 references have occurred in past history. All the others remain to occur at some stage in the future. But not one of those verses actually tells us what caused that darkness. That remains a mystery until the 21st chapter of Revelation. Only then are we introduced to a celestial object that could cause the light of the sun to be blocked for a prolonged period. There is only one mention in the whole of Scripture of the celestial object that could cause that prolonged darkness. It is the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21, verses 15 and 16. The city is laid out in a square, its length equal with its width, 1,500 miles, with its length, its width, and its height all being the same. Hence the question must be asked, why did the author of Revelation give such detailed dimensions of the city, unless it had some bearing on earlier parts of the Scriptures? The unique feature about those dimensions is that when you inscribe a circle round the outer corners of that 1,500-mile cube, the matching circle almost exactly matches the face of the moon. Therefore, it is possible that even likely that the time of both the Exodus and the execution of Yeshua, that the body travelled between the earth and the sun, approximately in the orbit of our moon. Could the New Jerusalem have passed in the region of the earth at that stage? I've shown the slide which will give you an indication of the size and the actual mathematics of it. Now, moving on to the next encounter, all 4 Gospels give a brief account of the events that occurred at the time of Yeshua's death. Mark, in chapter 15, just before Yeshua offered up his spirit, one of the bystanders put a vinegar-soaked sponge to his lips. But Yeshua did not drink. Instead, he cried out and died. So why did he not drink from the sponge? The Gospels don't say. But if we look at the event from a Hebraic perspective, we see that he could not drink vinegar, which is soured wine, because it was the beginning of Pesach. And vinegar is a leavening agent. He was forbidden by Torah to drink it. Then, in Matthew 27, verse 51, at that moment, the paracot, or curtain, of the temple was ripped from top to bottom, and there was an earthquake, with rocks splitting apart. The earthquake occurred at the time Yeshua breathed his last. But what about the tearing of the temple curtain? It has been suggested by a number of scholars and commentators that rather than the paracet, this curtain, being torn, it actually fell to the floor as the large stone lintel above collapsed. Being one large stone, that lintel would have been prone to collapse, particularly with the weight of the curtain, which was extremely heavy. As the curtain and the lintel collapsed, it would have revealed the interior of the temple. Could it have been that the Roman officer guarding the execution saw what made him come to the realization that Yeshua truly was the Son of God? There is nothing specific in the Gospels that suggests why the Roman guard came to this realization that the man hanging on the middle stake truly was the King of the Jews, which had been written on the plaque above his head. Could it be that the Roman soldier had, at the time of the earthquake, seen the light of the temple menorah suddenly penetrate that deep darkness? With the curtain crashing to the floor, he would have been looking directly into the holy place, just as the Cohen had done at the time of slaughtering the red heifer and sprinkling its blood towards the temple. If that reasoning is correct, the Roman officer would have been the first person to actually see the actual light of the menorah. He would have been a true witness of what Matthew says in chapter 27, verses 52 to 54, where he speaks there about also the graves being opened and the bodies of many people that had died were raised to life. When the Roman officer and those who were with him were keeping watch over Yeshua saw the earthquake and what had happened, they were awestruck and said, "He really is the Son of God." None of the emissaries were present when Yeshua died. So the testimony of the Roman officer and the other witnesses present could be the only ones to see the graves open and the temple curtain collapse. And that could only occur if they were right there on the western slopes of the Mount of Olives. So if Yeshua died at the location where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now stands, none of those events would have been visible. Therefore, what has been recorded in the Gospels would have to have been written based purely on hearsay. Only if he died on the western slopes of the Mount of Olives could the Gospel narratives have been based on true eyewitness accounts. As Talmudim of Yeshua, we accept the Gospel accounts as a true record of the events that occurred. Therefore, Yeshua had to have died facing the temple, just as the priest who had sprinkled the blood of the red heifer had to face the temple. What about the other structural damage? That would have occurred as a result of that earthquake. Considerable damage was done to the whole temple complex. Not only did the lintel collapse and the curtain fall, there was much damage that was done was not mentioned in the Gospels. One example can be taken from the Talmudic writings, where it mentions the Hall of Hewn Stone, where the Sanhedrin held their meetings. It was destroyed, the very place where Yeshua had been tried earlier that same day. The Hall of Hewn Stone itself formed an integral part of the wall between the outer and the inner courts of the temple, and formed part of the petition, the wall of petition, which Paul spoke about later in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. The Talmudic writings, Rosh Hashanah 31a, also speaks about how the Sanhedrin had to move following the earthquake, saying that from that point onward the Sanhedrin was exiled and moved from the Hall of the Hewn Stone to 10 different locations before the Sanhedrin finally went out of existence. Further, in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 41a, it says, 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the Chamber of Hewn Stone and sat in a shop near the Temple Mount. The Sanhedrin no longer judged cases of capital law. Once the Sanhedrin left the Chamber of Hewn Stone, the court's power to judge capital cases was annulled. That's from the Talmud itself. There are two vitally important points in those texts that need to be considered. Firstly, the destruction of the Hall of Hewn Stone occurred 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, which of course confirms that Yeshua died in 30 CE. Secondly, the Sanhedrin lost its authority to judge capital crimes. That in itself shows that the trial and death of Yeshua brought an end to the place of their meeting and also their authority. Clearly, the instant of Yeshua's death was a turning point for the whole of first century Israel and finally led to the destruction of the Second Temple. The next significant feature was the laying of Yeshua in the tomb. Soon after 3 p.m., Yosef of Ramatam approached Pilate and asked for approval to remove Yeshua's body from the stake. Scripture always requires 2 witnesses. So we see that Joseph, was supported by Nicodemus, or Nicodemus, who was likely with Joseph when he approached Pilate. So who were Joseph and Nicodemus? Mark says Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, who trusted in Yeshua, albeit as a closet believer, who was looking forward to the kingdom of God. Similarly, Nicodemus was a member of the ruling Judean authority. He was the one with whom Yeshua had dialogued extensively about being born again in Yochanan chapter 3. Together, Joseph and Nicodemus took Yeshua down from the stake and laid him in the tomb before sundown on the 14th day of Aviv. So where is the real garden tomb? In verses 41 to 42, we are told in the vicinity of where he had been executed was a garden, and in the garden there was a tomb in which no one had ever been buried. So because it was preparation day for the Judeans, and because the tomb was close by, that is where they buried Yeshua. As the tomb was close to where he was executed, it suggests it may possibly have been an unmarked tomb, which is still visible in the grounds of the Russian Orthodox Church of Mary Magdalene, which to this day is situated on the western slopes of the Mount of Olives, below where Yeshua was most likely executed, in a direct line again with the position of the original sanctuary. So the burial of Yeshua. After he died, Joseph went to Pilate seeking approval for his burial. But Pilate had to first gain assurance from the guards that Yeshua was in fact dead. His officer had witnessed his last moments, as mentioned earlier, and he was the most likely the one who would have confirmed for Pilate that Yeshua was dead. Pilate gave orders to have the body taken down from the stake so that it could be laid in the tomb. That whole process had to take place in 3 hours between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. because he was to be laid in the tomb before sundown, the beginning of Pesach in Jerusalem. So we'll leave Yeshua sleeping in the tomb until next Shabbat, when we will look more deeply again into the events that took place over the days and nights he lay in the tomb, and consider the significance of Bikurim and his immortal body in the next episode. It has been a long journey through the events following on from the end of Yeshua's last meal until he finally slept in death. I hope you see through this journey that when considered from a Hebraic perspective, the whole narrative as set out in the 4 Gospels paints a totally different picture from what really happened and the reasons why certain events played out differently from what has been portrayed over the centuries. What I've endeavored to show is that this morning is that the circumstances of the common people of Yehuda found themselves in during the days of Yeshua's life was primarily brought about through the work of the Judean authorities, who were, effectively, the first century reflection of the modern deep state that has subtly impacted upon the modern state of Israel from the shadows over the past few decades. Now we will consider in more detail how that deep state of the first century is also working hard to bring down the nation of Israel in this 21st century world. As we go further into the book of Revelation, following the second part of this analysis of Yeshua's death, resurrection, and ascension, we will see in more detail just how all these things are coming to fruition and why it is so important to know what actually transpired in that time between his last meal and his sleep in the tomb. So until next week, Shabbat Shalom.